3 days before the biggest signing ceremony of the year, a company refused to pay a quiet single man $40 for 8 hours of honest work and told him to take it to court if he wanted it that badly. Nobody in that glass tower thought to ask what he had spent the day doing or why his hands were still faintly dusted with concrete residue as he stood at the payment counter waiting for a form that never came. Elias Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not slam the counter or demand a manager. He closed his laptop bag, slid a folder of photographs and readings back inside it, and walked out into the cold autumn rain that had been falling over Chicago since morning. What none of them understood, not the receptionist who laughed under her breath, not the accountant who shrugged and moved on, not even the woman who gave the order to make him wait as though his time weighed nothing, was that the man leaving their building was the only structural consultant who had actually found the flaw buried inside their newest tower. A flaw that could unravel a deal worth more than $1 billion. If you believe in the quiet kind of justice, the kind that arrives without a raised voice, subscribe and stay with me, because 72 hours later, in front of bankers and reporters and partners, watching from 3 continents, the number written at the bottom of a settlement would read $12 million. Elias Mercer was 41 years old, and he had built a steady life out of precision. He worked as an independent structural inspector and risk assessor, the kind of professional companies called when they needed a second set of eyes. They could trust completely, someone with no stake in the outcome except the truth. He had been divorced for several years, and though he lived alone now in a modest apartment on the north side, his days were shaped by discipline rather than sentiment. He measured twice, documented everything, and never signed his name to anything he had not personally verified. Colleagues described him almost the same way without exception: unhurried, unshakable, impossible to rattle, the sort of man who could deliver bad news about a failing beam in the same even tone he used to discuss the weather. He had learned that steadiness early, back when a louder inspector might have been dismissed as an alarmist and ignored. Quiet certainty, he had come to believe, carried further than noise ever could. That morning, Ashcroft Urban Holdings had called him in on short notice. They needed an emergency inspection finished in a single day before their flagship tower could be cleared for a major investment closing. The call came from a frazzled mid-level coordinator who explained that their usual firm had a scheduling conflict and that the timeline could not slip even by a day. Elias cleared his calendar, packed his laser equipment, his cameras, and his notebooks, and arrived before sunrise. He worked alone, as he always did, moving from the underground levels upward with methodical patience, pausing at every junction, every seam, every place where one material met another. By the time the sun had fully risen over the skyline, he had logged more measurements than most inspectors take in a week, filling page after page of his notebook in careful, legible handwriting. Something on the 3rd sublevel stopped him. I was crouched beside a support column, running a gloved hand along the concrete, cross-checking the area against the blueprints on his tablet when the numbers refused to agree. The original plans called for a specific grade of reinforced steel across the primary load-bearing beams supporting the tower's northern wing. The material actually installed did not match. It was subtle, the kind of substitution invisible to anyone not trained to look for it, the kind that saved a contractor money up front while leaving a structure quietly vulnerable under years of sustained stress. He photographed it from several angles. He took laser measurements to confirm the deviation, then took them again. He noted the anomaly carefully in his preliminary report, and then, unwilling to let the discovery rush the rest of his work, he finished walking the building. When the inspection was done, he submitted his findings to the front desk, exactly as instructed, a printed summary and a note that a detailed report would follow within the day. Then he asked politely about payment, a modest processing fee of $40 agreed in advance, separate from the full consulting invoice that would be billed later through standard channels. The woman behind the counter looked at her screen and frowned. "There's a delay. Something about a missing signature from finance. I can't clear it on my end, I'm sorry." "That's all right," Elias said. "I'll wait." He set his equipment case down beside the bench without a hint of impatience. He waited nearly 2 hours seated on a leather bench beneath a wall of framed awards for architectural excellence. Employees passed without a glance, phones pressed to their ears, coffee cups in hand, the ordinary rhythm of a company convinced nothing could touch it. Twice he approached the desk to ask politely whether there had been any update. Twice the young receptionist gave the same apologetic shrug. Twice he thanked her and returned to the bench reviewing his photographs on his tablet. Eventually, the CEO herself crossed the lobby on her way to a meeting. Vivian Ashcroft was 39, sharp-featured in a tailored charcoal suit that made her look like she had stepped off the cover of a business magazine. She noticed him only because an assistant murmured something about a vendor complaint. "What's the holdup?" Vivian asked. "He's waiting on a payment, $40. Finance flagged a signature." Vivian let out a short, dismissive laugh that carried across the marble floor. $40. She said it loudly enough for the cluster of employees nearby to hear. "You're really going to stand in my lobby over $40 while there are people upstairs closing deals worth more than your whole year before lunch?" A few of the younger staff laughed along, the kind of laughter that comes not from amusement, but from the instinct to stand near power. Elias looked up, met her eyes for a moment, and said nothing at all. Somehow the silence irritated her more than any protest would have. "He can wait," Vivian told her assistant, already turning away. "Finance will get to it. I have a meeting that actually matters." Her heels clicked sharply toward the executive elevators, and she was gone. The receptionist shot him an apologetic look. Elias only offered a small nod, the kind that told her he did not hold it against her. Whatever was wrong here started well above the front desk. I sat back down, opened his tablet, and returned to the photographs from the third sublevel, studying the deviation one more time while the lobby carried on around him, as though he were a piece of the furniture, in a way that suited him. People rarely say anything worth hearing while they think you don't matter. When the accountant finally returned, it was with a form labeled "Unpaid Services Pending Review." Elias read it once, signed it without complaint, and slid it back across the counter. Then he gathered his case, buttoned his coat against the chill that crept in every time the doors opened, and walked out through the revolving doors into the steadily building rain. Nobody who watched him leave imagined that the calm, unremarkable man crossing the parking lot was carrying inside a worn leather folder, the single most important piece of information the company would need in the days ahead. His silence in that lobby had not been resignation. It was the decision of a man who had learned long ago that dignity does not require a raised voice. On the drive home, he stopped at a red light and paged back through the morning's images. The deviation bothered him more the longer he looked. Back at his apartment, he sat in the parked car with the engine off, cross-referencing his laser readings against the manufacturer specifications in his files, checking and rechecking until he was certain there was no error on his end. Left uncorrected, the deficiency would almost certainly fail the standards required by the building's insurance underwriters. And any serious investment partner running proper due diligence would eventually find the same discrepancy, whether through his report or through an inspection commissioned later. The responsible course was simple and required no drama. Someone at Ashcroft needed to know, needed to fix it, and needed to do so before outside parties relied on the building's safety rating to move hundreds of millions of dollars. He had no interest in punishing anyone or proving a point. He wanted only for the correction to happen. That evening, from his kitchen table, he composed a formal warning email. He attached the photographs, the laser readings, and a plain written explanation of the risk, describing the deviation in neutral technical language and recommending a follow-up inspection before any documentation moved to outside parties. He sent it to the project manager, copied the general address for engineering compliance, and checked his inbox now and then, through the evening out of habit more than expectation. No reply came that night or the next morning. When he tried to follow up by phone, the call rang out 3 times before a receptionist finally picked up and told him awkwardly that his email address had been blocked from the company's system entirely. The order had been given quietly at Vivian's request after she was briefed on the persistent inspector still trying to reach her office. She issued it almost as an afterthought between 2 meetings, a nuisance, rather than anything requiring attention. Miles Donovan, the company's chief counsel, told a junior staffer plainly that nobody needed to bother the CEO over a matter involving $40, and that if the inspector had a real concern, he could put it in writing and mail it the traditional way, knowing exactly how long that would take and how easily it could be ignored once it arrived. Elias did not escalate. He did not threaten legal action, and he made no attempt to reach anyone else once his access was cut. He simply saved every email he had sent, time-stamped and organized into a folder labeled with the building's address, along with screenshots of each message's delivery status and the eventual bounce-back notifications. He printed hard copies, too, a habit from earlier years, and filed them chronologically in a binder in his home office. It was not anger, and it was not preparation for revenge. It was only the same discipline that governed every part of his work, quietly building a record that no one at Ashcroft yet understood they would come to need. Inside the tower, preparations for the largest transaction in the company's history moved forward without pause, oblivious to the warning sitting unread in a blocked inbox on the company's own servers. Vivian was preparing to close a deal worth $1,400,000,000 with one of the most respected investment funds in the country. An agreement that would transform her company from a regional developer into a national name. The office had been swept into celebration weeks early. Banners commissioned, catering arranged, press releases drafted before a single signature touched paper. That week she gave interviews to business journalists in which she spoke with total confidence about the soundness of her flagship property. There was no risk in the underlying asset, she said. Every inspection had come back clean. Investors could trust the numbers completely. She believed this not because she had verified it, but because she had never needed to before. Money had always solved her problems, smoothed over her oversights, and quieted the people who might have told her otherwise. Nothing in her experience had given her reason to expect this time would be different. Rachel Kim was not so sure. At 35, the company's quality control director had spent years reviewing documentation behind the scenes, rarely credited the kind of employee whose work only becomes visible when something goes wrong. As she assembled the final compliance binder for the fund's due diligence team, cross-referencing every page against a checklist she had refined over years of closings, she found a gap. The absence of a final signed verification from the independent structural consultant who had completed the emergency inspection days earlier. Without that signature, the entire package was technically incomplete. She brought it straight to Vivian, expecting a simple instruction. "It's a missing signature," Rachel said. "From the structural consultant on the emergency inspection. The package isn't complete without it. If their team looks closely..." "Rachel." Vivian didn't look up from her desk. "It's a formality from a contractor nobody will remember by next week. Don't turn it into a problem." Rachel left the office troubled. That evening, without telling anyone, she found Elias Mercer's contact information in the vendor records and dialed a number she had been explicitly told not to use. They met the next afternoon in a small coffee shop several blocks from the tower, chosen because neither of them wanted to be seen together by anyone from the company. Rachel arrived first and took a table near the back where the noise of the espresso machine would cover their conversation. When Elias walked in carrying the same leather folder he had carried out of the lobby days before, she almost didn't recognize him without the fluorescent light washing out his features. He nodded, ordered a black coffee, and sat down across from her, with none of the tension she had expected from a man treated so poorly by her employer only days earlier. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said. "After the way they treated you, I wasn't sure you would." "You called because something was bothering you," Elias said simply. "That's usually a good instinct to follow. I'll be honest with you, I was told directly not to call you. If anyone finds out I did, I'd probably lose my job." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I need to understand what I'm actually looking at." Elias opened the folder without hesitation. He showed her the photographs of the substituted material, the laser measurements documenting the deviation, the time-stamped video he had recorded walking the third sublevel, and the record of every email that had gone unanswered. He translated the technical language, patiently pointing to exactly where the installed material diverged from the specifications and what that meant for the tower's ability to hold up under sustained stress over time. "I never wanted a confrontation," he told her. "I assumed a company this size would have a simple process for handling exactly this kind of warning. Someone corrects the mistake before it becomes dangerous, and that's the end of it. I sent the email, then they blocked me." Rachel felt the color drain from her face as she paged through the evidence on his laptop. This was not a paperwork issue. It was a structural deficiency, serious enough to threaten the safety rating of the entire building, and with it, the deal her company was racing to close. She tested him the way her training had taught her, asking pointed questions, searching for any weakness or ambiguity that might explain why the company had dismissed him so easily. She found none. Every measurement was documented, every photograph time-stamped, every claim cross-referenced against the original blueprints. By the time she finished, her hands were faintly trembling, not from fear exactly, but from the growing certainty that she was sitting across from the only person in the entire organization who had told the truth from the beginning. She went back to the office that same evening and laid the printed report directly on Vivian's desk. "I need you to actually read this," she said as calmly as she could manage. "It's not the missing signature, it's what the signature was going to certify. The material in the northern wing doesn't match the spec. If the fund's engineers find it after closing—" Vivian barely glanced at the first page before her expression hardened the polished composure she wore for reporters, slipping into something colder. She picked up the report and without a word tore it in half in front of Rachel, letting the pages fall onto the desk between them. "I'm not going to let a $40 contractor derail a deal that took 18 months to negotiate," she said. "This is the single largest achievement of my career. Do you understand that?" "I'm trying to protect you from the legal exposure," Rachel said. "If they discover a concealed defect after signing it, unravels far more than the—" But Vivian was no longer listening, her attention already back on the stack of messages waiting on her desk. Within the hour, Rachel was called into Human Resources and told her position was being eliminated effective immediately. Her access badge was deactivated before she had even cleared out her desk. Years of careful, thankless work reduced to a single line in a termination file. Miles Donovan watched it unfold from his office down the hall and grew more uneasy as the day went on. He reminded Vivian privately, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had learned not to push too hard against her certainty, that with Rachel gone, no one internally was tracking the independent records, and that if the fund's technical team asked for final documentation, there would be nothing complete to show them. "No investor in their right mind walks away from a deal this size over a missing signature," Vivian said, waving him off the same way she had waved off Rachel. "If a question comes up, I'll handle it personally." Then the fund's compliance department sent a routine but firm request, asking for the final signed structural verification report ahead of the closing date. A standard step in any transaction of this size. Rather than reaching out to Elias to resolve it honestly, an option that would have cost her nothing but a phone call and a moment of humility. Vivian instructed a junior associate to produce a substitute document, one that recreated the format of Elias's report, but altered the critical findings to state that no deficiencies had been identified anywhere in the structure. She reviewed the falsified version herself, made a note about adjusting the formatting to look more official, and approved, certain it would never be checked against the original, and that the whole matter would disappear once the deal was signed. What Vivian did not know was that Noah Whitmore, the 56-year-old chairman of the investment fund, had a long-standing habit of verifying anything that looked too clean. The abrupt turnover in Ashcroft's quality control department, mentioned only in passing by a junior staffer during a routine call, struck him as worth a closer look. Rather than raise it through official channels, he quietly had his assistant track down the original inspector listed in the company's vendor records. Within a day, Elias Mercer received a formal letter requesting a private meeting signed personally by the chairman. They met in a plain conference room at the fund's downtown offices, far from the marble and glass of Ashcroft's headquarters. Just a wooden table, a carafe of water, and tall windows over the river. Noah did not ask about the $40. He did not mention the lobby, though he already knew about it through channels of his own, having spent enough years in business to know that the way a company treats the smallest person in a transaction often reveals more than any balance sheet. He asked one question. "The report with your name on it, is it genuine?" Elias opened his laptop and walked him through everything: the original photographs, the laser measurements, the time-stamped video, and the entire chain of emails that had been deliberately ignored. He spoke without embellishment, letting the data carry the weight rather than his tone. Noah listened without interrupting, leaning forward now and then to examine an image, asking sharp, specific questions about tolerance thresholds and load calculations that made clear he understood more about structural engineering than most executives bothered to learn. When Elias finished, Noah sat back for a long moment. "I'm going to have my own team verify every claim in here against the blueprints and the material certifications," he said. "No shortcuts. If you're right, I need to know exactly how right." 2 days of quiet cross-checking followed, conducted by a small team of engineers. Noah trusted none of them connected to Ashcroft, none with any incentive to reach a particular conclusion. Their findings confirmed that Elias's report was accurate down to the smallest detail, a full and precise match with no discrepancies anywhere. Noah made his decision the moment he read their summary. He froze the entire investment pending further review. but chose for now to say nothing publicly, preferring to gather every fact before taking a step that could not be undone. Vivian Ashcroft, still approving banners and press statements for the ceremony, had no idea. The deal she believed was secured had quietly stopped moving 3 days before she was scheduled to sign it. Her confidence was entirely undisturbed by a decision already made without her. The morning of the signing arrived with the kind of polished confidence that only comes from never having been told no. Ashcroft had transformed its top floor into a showcase of success. Reporters gathered near the windows. Banking representatives sat along one side of a long glass table. Partners from 3 continents watched remotely through a live feed projected onto the far wall. Wait staff circulated with trays of coffee and sparkling water. A photographer moved along the perimeter, capturing candid shots for the morning's coverage. The floor smelled faintly of the fresh flowers Vivian had personally approved the week before. She stood at the head of the room in a deep blue suit, delivering a speech about vision growth and the unshakable strength of her flagship property. Her voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the moment for months. She spoke of trust, of partnership, of a future built on solid foundations, gesturing now and then toward the architectural renderings on easels, beside her entirely unaware of how literally that phrase was about to be tested in front of every camera in the room. Miles Donovan stood near the back, arms folded, watching with an unease he had not been able to shake since Rachel's departure. As the final documents were placed on the table for signature, Noah Whitmore rose slowly from his seat. Instead of reaching for a pen, he let the room quiet. Uncertain at first whether this was part of the ceremony, he reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a bound document, setting it deliberately in the center of the table where every camera could see it. It was the original structural report, complete with Elias Mercer's photographs, his laser readings, and his signature at the bottom of the final page. The very report Vivian had dismissed as unworthy of her attention. A hush spread across the room. Reporters leaned forward, phones already recording. Vivian's practiced smile faltered as her eyes fell on the signature, a name she had heard once in passing and never bothered to remember. Noah addressed the room without theatrics, in the same measured tone he had used with Elias days earlier. Before anyone signs, there's something everyone in this room needs to see. My fund's own engineers have independently verified every finding in this report. The deficiency it describes poses a direct risk to the safety rating that underpins this entire investment. He paused. The document previously submitted to my compliance team, the one certifying that no issues existed, does not match this original in its critical findings. My legal counsel will be reviewing that discrepancy immediately, along with the question of how 2 conflicting reports came to exist in the first place. The bankers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. A reporter near the back was already typing furiously, sensing that the story she had come to cover had just changed entirely. Mr. Whitmore, Vivian began, forcing her smile back into place. I think there's been a misunderstanding between contractors. Our compliance report is— Your compliance report, Noah said quietly, is the one that doesn't match. The engineer whose signature is on this original was the first inspector your company hired. I warned you in writing 3 separate times before this room was ever decorated. He tapped the bound document once. I have those emails too. So does everyone whose money you were about to take. Vivian opened her mouth to respond, reaching for the confidence that had carried her through every difficult moment of her career. The same instinct that had let her laugh off a man waiting quietly in her lobby. For the first time in longer than she could remember, no words came at all. Somewhere behind her, a partner on the video feed reached forward and ended the call. Within the hour, the fund issued a formal statement suspending the transaction entirely, citing material misrepresentation in the due diligence documentation provided by Ashcroft Urban Holdings. The statement was brief, carefully worded, and made no direct accusations, though anyone reading between the lines understood exactly what had happened. Under the preliminary agreement, both parties had already signed the suspension, triggered a significant penalty clause, one requiring Ashcroft to compensate the fund for costs, reputational damage, and lost opportunity. The final figure, calculated over the following days, came to $12 million, a number that appeared in financial headlines by the end of the week. News of the collapse moved from trading floors to industry newsletters within hours. By the next morning, Ashcroft's stock had fallen sharply, and several long-standing partners quietly began withdrawing from other joint ventures, unwilling to be associated with a company whose credibility had just been shattered on camera. Vivian attempted damage control through hastily arranged interviews, insisting the discrepancy was a simple misunderstanding between contractors and that her company remained committed to the highest standards of safety and transparency. The explanation convinced almost no one, least of all the reporters who had watched the moment unfold live and had already reviewed the falsified report themselves. As the fund's legal team began its inquiry, Miles Donovan discovered the thing that turned an embarrassing business failure into a far more serious legal exposure. Working late one evening on a defense strategy, he asked an internal technician to restore the blocked email account, expecting to find little of consequence. Instead, buried in the company's own servers, untouched, since the day they were blocked sat the complete chain of emails Elias had sent weeks earlier, each one time-stamped, each one detailing the exact deficiency later confirmed by independent engineers, each one met with silence or deliberate obstruction. Miles read the chain twice, his stomach sinking with each message. The record made it clear that Ashcroft had not simply overlooked a risk through carelessness. The company had been formally warned repeatedly in writing and had chosen to block the warning, discredit the inspector, and manufacture a false document rather than fix the problem while there was still time. The fund's attorneys moved quickly, requesting all internal correspondence related to the inspection, along with sworn statements from anyone involved in producing the falsified report. Rachel Kim, though no longer employed there, agreed without hesitation to give a full account, including the moment Vivian tore the original report in half in front of her and the conversation that followed. She answered every question directly, providing dates and details that matched the recovered email trail precisely. Her testimony, combined with the correspondence, left Ashcroft's legal team almost no room to maneuver. Vivian was formally required to accept responsibility for authorizing the falsified document, a decision that carried both significant financial penalties and lasting professional consequences that would follow her well beyond the settlement. Miles Donovan, unwilling to keep defending decisions he had quietly warned against from the start, resigned within the week, telling colleagues privately that he could not in good conscience remain at a company that had chosen deception over a correction that would have cost almost nothing to make. Ashcroft Urban Holdings, once celebrated in industry publications for its rapid growth and ambitious vision, found its name attached instead to headlines about corporate negligence and lost investor trust. A reputation built carefully over more than a decade unraveled in a matter of days because of a decision that had seemed at the time almost too small to matter. Roughly a week after the collapse signing, Vivian asked through an intermediary whether Elias would meet her in person. She had spent the days since the ceremony largely out of view, fielding calls from her board, her attorneys, and the handful of partners, still deciding whether to keep any association with her company. Somewhere in that difficult week, she had found herself returning again and again to the memory of the lobby, replaying the sound of her own laughter, and wondering for the first time in longer than she could recall whether she had misjudged something important. Elias agreed and chose the same modest coffee shop where Rachel had once brought him her worries. Vivian arrived alone, without assistants or lawyers, dressed more plainly than she had been at any point in the whole ordeal, carrying a small folder of her own. Inside was a cashier's check and a written apology she had drafted and redrafted the night before, unsure how to put into words the weight of what had happened. She set both on the table between them, along with 2 crisp $20 bills, the exact sum that had started everything. "I misjudged you," she said. "Badly. The check is for your time, your reputation, everything the last 2 weeks cost you. It doesn't come close, I know that." Elias looked at the check for a long moment, then slid it back across the table untouched. He picked up only the 2 20s, folded them, and placed them in his coat pocket. "I never needed your money," he said. "I needed you to keep your word. That's all this ever was. The whole thing could have ended the first afternoon if one person in that building had treated an ordinary request with ordinary respect." Vivian pushed the check toward him again. "You earned far more than the settlement. Please." He shook his head. "Money was never the issue, not once. You could have fixed the building. You could have fixed the deal. All you ever had to fix was the way you looked at the person in front of you." He stood and buttoned his coat. "That part's still yours to work on." She sat in silence, the statement settling over her more heavily than any legal penalty had managed to. She thought back to the lobby, to the sound of her own laughter echoing off the marble, to the ease with which she had waved away a man who had done nothing but ask to be paid for work he had honestly finished. She had looked at him and decided he was not worth her attention, that his request was too small to matter, that his time carried no value beside her own. 3 days later, that single decision made in a moment of careless pride had cost her company $12 million, driven away partners who had trusted her for years, and unraveled a reputation she had spent her entire career building. She left the coffee shop that afternoon without the check ever having been accepted, carrying instead a lesson she would spend a long time trying to absorb. In the months that followed, Elias Mercer's practice grew steadily, his name circulating quietly among developers and investment firms as someone whose word could be trusted completely. Someone who documented everything and compromised on nothing, regardless of who sat across the table. Requests arrived faster than he could accept them, many from companies that had heard the story secondhand and wanted above all an inspector who could not be pressured or dismissed. He remained the same in every meeting, arriving early, measuring twice, refusing to sign anything he had not personally verified, unchanged by the sudden attention. Noah Whitmore, impressed by the composure and precision Elias had shown throughout, invited him to join the fund as a senior advisor on risk assessment. "I could use someone on my side of the table who can't be talked out of the truth," Noah told him. "I've met 100 people who tell me what I want to hear. I've met exactly one this year who didn't." Elias accepted on the condition that he could keep doing his independent inspections alongside it, unwilling to give up the fieldwork that had shaped his whole career. The two men built a quiet professional respect over the following months, grounded less in conversation than in the simple fact that each had proven in his own way that thoroughness matters more than convenience. Noah liked to say to anyone who would listen that the cheapest insurance his fund had ever bought cost $40, and a company had refused to pay it. Rachel Kim, after several difficult weeks searching for work, found a position at a firm that valued exactly the kind of careful, unglamorous diligence that had once cost her a job and later helped expose the truth. She often thought back to the evening she made that call, a decision that had felt uncertain, even reckless at the time, and came to understand it as the moment she had chosen, without fully realizing it, to trust her own judgment over the comfort of staying silent. The story of the man refused $40, and the company that lost $12 million because of it began to circulate in business circles as a quiet lesson about the true cost of arrogance, repeated at conferences and cited in the occasional article on corporate governance. It became over time a reminder that the respect owed to any person, whatever the size of the transaction in front of them, is never as small as it appears in the moment it is withheld, and that the true measure of a company reveals itself not in how it treats its largest partners, but in how it treats the quiet, ordinary people it assumes no one is watching. If this story stayed with you, do one small thing before you go. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me about a time your patience quietly outlasted someone's arrogance. I read every single one.